Mick Dunford is next. He's an emeritus professor from University of Sussex in England, visiting professor at the Chinese Academy of Sciences, and he's also managing editor of the journal Area Development and Policy. Mick is based in China and keeps a close eye on the developments there, continues to study particularly urban China, and he always has useful and insightful comments to make. So over to you there, Mick.
Okay. So thank you very much indeed for this opportunity to comment on Elias and Alberto's new and impressive study. Elias and Alberto have written a significant and important book. First, in its concern with China, Vietnam, and Laos, and especially in relation to the articulation of a regulatory or market rational state with a developmental or plan rational state setting substantive economic and social goals. In the end, they also seek to define the socialist characteristics that are associated with China's socialist market economy. And interestingly, they do so by saying, and I quote, under the leadership of the Communist Party of China. When I read that, I remembered that in 1975, Mao said, at the moment, our country employs a commodity system, and the wage system is unequal as well. Such things can only be restricted under the dictatorship of the proletariat. I found in this volume that the authors actually cite Marx on the structure of politics and on the cultural, legal superstructures. But I think, you know, one also needs a theory of politics, and indeed, in the Chinese case, one needs a theory of culture. So in a sense, one of the most important features of China is that in contrast to societies in which the capitalist mode of production predominates.
Mick, may I just, sorry to interrupt, but your mic is very close to your, like we are hearing a lot of static.
Echo, okay. So in contrast to societies in which the capitalist mode of production predominates and the state is capitalist, corporatist, or oligarchic, in China, essentially, capitalists are not the ruling class. The Communist Party of China is the ruling class, and it's one of the most fundamental characteristics of and fundamental determinants of China's economic, political, cultural trajectories. In the theoretical sections, Elias and Alberto seem to start with a theory about the inevitability of market regulation. At an early stage, they say, and I quote, you know, market-based constraints of the meta mode of production cannot be superseded in the present historical phase and might be progressively overcome only in the very long term. And yet, by the time they reach the end of their discussion of the Chinese case, they identify the emergence of, we call it progettamento. When I saw it first, it reminded me of Matsukuto's mission-oriented restructuring of economic life, right? To innovate and achieve common goals and objectives and to share risks and rewards. But what they identify is an economy with plans and projects, strong state-owned corporations, a public banking system, public development banks, substantial collective resources, playing a leading role in the development of the Chinese economy. And towards the end, they actually speak about China's recent development heralding, and again, I quote, an increased role of rationally conceived and formulated proactive state-led actions in the economy as a whole, while gently downgrading that of automatic market regulation mechanisms. And they identify, you know, a historical process where the act of projecting large-scale investments becomes increasingly central to the overall development strategy. And then they note, and it's extremely important, I mean, they note that in the early part of the new millennium, China started to prioritize technological progress, indigenous innovation, environmental protection, high-quality development, a fourth industrial revolution, or is it a sixth industrial revolution? but they don't actually elaborate much on these plans, nor do they actually pay a lot of emphasis to China's counter-cyclical investment programs, including, the massive programs for rural development, the massive programs for northeastern, central, and western development, and so on. However, it seems to me that this argument about the recent development of China is perhaps one of the most important contributions of this volume. But, I noticed a couple of issues that I suppose I thought might have been discussed, because in capitalist societies, investment depends on profitability. If in China, one sees the emergence of a capitalist class and capitalist enterprises, are they subject to that declining trend in the rate of profit? And if so, what are the implications? So it's one of the laws, that Marx developed in relation to his account of capitalism that is in a sense extremely important, and yet it's scarcely discussed in this particular volume. And one can also point out that markets are essentially incapable of distinguishing between useful and spurious uses of resources. So on the one hand, one has the construction of infrastructure for a carbon neutral economy, and on the other one has private air travel. Essentially, it prioritizes the consumption of the ultra rich, and it settles competing consumption claims according to ability to pay, and almost solely in terms of ability to pay. So these are issues, that I think need to be discussed in relation to this particular articulation of planning and market that's analysed in this important volume. The second point is a much shorter one. I mean, the authors present an argument about markets, and this is associated with the view that surplus value will continue to be produced. And then that unproductive sectors, and they refer to health and education, must remain within very strict limits. I think it raises important questions. I mean, does unproductive labor actually produce value? That doesn't produce surplus value. Does private education and private health produce surplus value? Is the constant capital invested in education passed on in value terms? Is it financed out of surplus value, or is it actually an overhead? So I think there are a lot of issues, to do with the analysis of what they call unproductive labor and the role of public services in relation to thinking about the developments, especially at present, of the Chinese economy. The third point is, as they show, our world comprises a series of societies or social formations. They say social economic formations. And they say a social formation is a combination of one or more modes of production. They say modes of production and exchange, or you could say modes of production, distribution, consumption, and exchange, or even of reproduction. So this goes back to Marx, Althusser, the analysis and the articulation of modes of production. And in my view, they are essentially correct. But also, a society is part of an international order. There are internal and external relations that shape their development, as are examined in Trotskyist approaches to uneven combined development. In the volume, imperialism emerges only on page 115. But if you look at China's opening up, its market reform, it actually started with ping-pong diplomacy. It started with Nixon's visit to China, with China's entry into a Western-controlled, rules-based order. Although, as they show, China had the strength to set many of the rules for itself by virtue of its retention of monetary and financial sovereignty, its ability to control its exchange rate, its ability to enforce capital controls. Although when it entered the World Trade Organization, it actually had to start to make certain concessions in relation to the opening of the capital account. But with Obama's pivot to the Pacific, and in fact earlier, of course, the international circumstances, as Chan Wen-Fu pointed out very clearly just now, started to change in significant ways. And these, in combination with internal changes, are profoundly reshaping China's path. The Belt and Road Initiative, dual circulation, the strategic alliance with Russia, new development banks, collective common prosperity. So the fourth point I wanted to make is that The categories that I just discussed, mode of production and so on, relate to the objective characteristics, so the socialist orientation relative to capitalist orientation of particular economies. Yet they add, and it's an extremely important point, they add normative characteristics, equitable distribution of income, elimination of poverty, protection of the environment, and so on. In the 1980s, Deng Xiaoping often mentioned that the predominance of public ownership and common prosperity are the two fundamental socialist principles. He said, and I quote, the aim of socialism is to make all our people prosperous, not to create polarization. If our policies led to polarization, it would mean that we had failed. If a new bourgeoisie emerged, it would mean that we had strayed from the right path. So this normative dimension adds vital considerations, but they too cannot be separated from uneven development of productive forces and the position of China and indeed of other countries that embark on socialist paths within the International Division of Labour, the degree of subservience to Western financial institutions and so on. So one needs to look at the articulation of the external and the internal. I was going to say, that in relation to this idea of the articulation of modes of production, in the West, as they point out in the book, some social progress occurred, especially after 1945 until the 1970s. And in a way, one could argue that Western societies at that stage were in fact a combination of two modes of production, a capitalist mode of production and a welfare state, because the welfare state involved a partial decommodification of labor. And in fact, if you remember in Capital, so in chapter 6, then in a sense Marx defines what differentiates capitalism from other commodity producing systems, where he points to the way in which in capitalism, labor itself becomes a commodity separated from the means of production and exchange. Beyond that, I would say that some questions can be raised about the analysis of the household responsibility system. In particular, I think one can raise questions about their questioning of the adoption of cooperatives and of the commune system in the early stages of the construction of the new China. I think that they give perhaps too little attention to the Green Revolution in the 1970s. They give too little attention to the enormous increase in agricultural prices in the early 1980s. And more specifically, I think that the achievements of the first 30 years warrant far more emphasis, as in Cheng En-fu's account. Beyond that, however, I think that they have provided a great service. And in short, basically, I think that Alberto and Elias provide a significant and important contribution that will hopefully persuade all on the left that they should, critically where necessary, support all those countries that seek to embark on a very difficult path to socialism. And they should seek to avoid judging the complex and difficult choices and complex and difficult paths to socialism that countries adopt as they try to move in the direction of a better world. They should not simply judge them in terms of these abstract and ideal characteristics of, let's say, communism and socialism, but more in the kind of open way in which Elias and Gabriele have analyzed them in this important book. Okay, thank you.
I'm Michael Hudson. I'm appearing here for the International Manifesto Group. If you like this video and ones like it, please subscribe. For more information, go to the address on the screen.